Hello YouTube. There's an interesting article by Sami Pihlstrom, Ethical Unthinkabilities and Philosophical Seriousness, in which he argues that some philosophical views are unthinkable, where he means this in the following sense. So the views in question are intolerable or dangerous, and so they are impossible to accept, no matter how strong the arguments in favour of those views. So Pihlstrom denies the meta-philosophical thesis that the best argument wins. We shouldn't follow the argument wherever it leads. If an argument leads to an unthinkability, then the argument must be refused. Indeed, Pihlstrom argues that we should refuse to even discuss unthinkabilities. We shouldn't produce any arguments for them in the first place. Or arguments against them, because they just shouldn't be discussed, right? We shouldn't engage in even evaluating this theory. Now, it's important to note that Pihlstrom does not advocate for censorship here. His claim is only that it is ethically wrong to discuss certain views. He doesn't argue that it should be illegal to discuss them. What's significant here is, what this means for philosophy, right? Traditionally, we think that philosophy is based on argument. We defend philosophical views by assessing the arguments for and against them. If Pihlstrom is right, then philosophers have to assess views on ethical grounds before the question of argument even arises. There are some philosophical views that violate values that are more important than the ideal of sound argument. So there are some philosophical views where we just shouldn't even begin engaging in arguments for them. So, as an illustration of this idea, Pihlstrom considers the example of antinatalism, as defended by David Benatar. Pihlstrom is going to argue that antinatalism is unthinkable in the relevant sense. So antinatalism is the view that coming into existence is always a harm for those who come into existence, so it would be better never to have come into existence. If you're interested in the details of Benatar's arguments, I've linked one of my videos on antinatalism in the comments. His basic argument is the asymmetry argument. There's an asymmetry between pleasure and pain in the following sense. The presence of pain is bad, and the presence of pleasure is good. The absence of pain is good, even if that good is not enjoyed by anybody. But the absence of pleasure is not bad, unless there's somebody for whom that absence is a deprivation. So those who never come into existence do not suffer any harm as a result of never coming into existence. But there's an absence of pain, which is good. There's an absence of pleasure, which is not bad. But whereas those who come into existence are harmed by the presence of pain. So coming into existence is always going to be a net harm. Again, I've discussed this argument in much more detail in the other video. But that's the basic idea. So Pihlstrom says this is unthinkable. But why should we think that? Well, he raises a few different complaints. The first point, and this seems to be a more minor issue, is that Benatar frames his argument in terms of economic metaphors. So Benatar says that coming into existence is a net harm rather than a net benefit. He says that existence comes at a significant cost, that existence is not worth its cost, that we pay too high a price for existence. Benatar assesses the value of life by weighing up costs and benefits. He's thinking of each life as an aggregate of positive and negative experiences and asking whether the negative outweighs the positive. And this kind of economic discourse is contrary to how we ought to value our lives. Now, Pihlstrom is a little unclear about what he would prefer here, about how he would prefer that we think of things. In a footnote, he mentions the Kantian idea that, and I quote, "As human beings, we do not have any economically measurable value, but have a much more fundamental valuableness simply based on the fact that we are humans." The point seems to be that it's in some way kind of contrary to our basic values to even think about human beings as being these sort of creatures where we're just like aggregates of positive and negative experiences that might be weighed up against each other. Now, of course, this sort of talk of costs and benefits is something of an idealization, which I think Benatar himself would admit. I think he would admit that. But it's hard to see really how using these sorts of metaphors, I mean, even if it's somehow mistaken or misleading to use these metaphors, it's hard to see how this is so far removed from our values that it places Benatar's work outside the realm of reasonable discussion. I mean, people will often weigh up the costs and benefits of doing various things. And when we experience suffering, it can be helpful to think of the benefits that we receive that outweigh the suffering. So, the fear of visiting the dentist is outweighed by the benefits of maintaining healthy teeth, and it's can be useful to actually keep that in mind and to think of the benefits as outweighing the suffering. I think when people consider whether or not to have children, I mean, so whether, like, am I going to bring another person into this world? Well, one of the things they will consider is the costs and benefits of doing that. I mean, especially if it's somebody who, let's say I've got a heritable disease or something like that, and I start thinking, well, look, the child might have this, but even if they do have this, you can still have a good life with this disease. So you kind of weigh these things up. That seems like something that people will sometimes do, and there are many moral theories that explicitly frame moral reasoning in these terms. I mean, take utilitarianism. Do what will produce the greatest good for the greatest number. For the utilitarian is only concerned about, maximizing states of pleasure and ensuring that pleasure outweighs pain. Now, obviously, Pihlstrom's citation of Kantianism indicates that he would reject these kinds of views, but it's one thing to disagree with a view, it's another to claim that the view is unthinkable and ought not to be discussed. So, I mean, it seems like these sort of economic metaphors alone presumably aren't the real core of the issue. As I said, though, Pihlstrom himself doesn't see this as a central problem. So I guess let's move on. The more serious problem with antinatalism is that it is, in a certain sense, self-defeating. So Pihlstrom points out, for example, that when discussing some of the benefits of existence, Benatar cites friendship. Friendship is one of the things about existence that is generally good. It's better not to be brought into existence. But if a person is brought into existence, we would hope that they are able to form long-term friendships. A life that contains friendship is better than a life that doesn't. But now, if we seriously believe that the ideal world is one in which there are no human beings, then we must believe that the ideal world is one in which there are no friendships. Friendship is possible only when there are people who exist who care about each other's lives. So the thought seems to be that by treating friendship as a value, Benatar undercuts his antinatalist thesis. Because in fact, on the one hand, Benatar's saying, friendship is something that's valuable, friendship is something that's good, but on the other hand, he's saying, no, the ideal world is one in which there just is no friendship at all. So the suggestion is that there's a kind of self-undermining thing here in Benatar's position. Now, while this problem of self-defeat is perhaps most vivid in the case of friendship, Pihlstrom argues that even basic normative concepts are going to be unavailable to people who reject fundamental assumptions about the value of human lives. So Pihlstrom says that Benatar, and I quote, rhetorically helps himself to some central concepts and values, e.g. the avoidance of suffering, belonging to the normal human form of life, from which he takes his radical departure. His way of arguing for the moral duty not to procreate any further human life eventually renders his employment of the idea of avoiding suffering unintelligible. It is unintelligible in the context he has chosen, because it is fully intelligible only within what I call a normal human life inevitably committed to promoting life. So, as I understand it, the thought here seems to be that the very idea of suffering as an evil that is to be avoided, the very idea of promoting pleasure as an aspect of well-being, these things make sense only if life is inherently valuable. We can only make sense of an imperative to avoid suffering within the context of an ordinary human life. I mean, what is it, after all, that makes suffering a bad thing? Suffering occurs in specific contexts for specific reasons, and each person is going to respond to it in different ways. I mean, so suffering might occur as a result of physical damage, like the body is injured in some way, right? That's going to make you suffer. Suffering might occur as a result of plans being frustrated, as when, I don't know, a person is robbed of their money, or I don't know, you have some goal in your career and you don't get the promotion, right? That causes suffering. Or it might result from fear of the future, right? We might worry about the consequences of climate change or something like that. There's a myriad of other reasons, but notice that all of these reasons occur within the context of a specific life, right? And these reasons are comprehensible only within a particular form of life where the value of that kind of life is affirmed. I think this is the way Pihlstrom would put it. Like when I suffer as a result of failing to get the promotion at my job, it's like, well, where does that suffering come from? It comes from a particular desire for a certain kind of life plan, right? It's like my plan for my life has been frustrated, and then suffering arises as a result. So it's like within the context of this form of life that I kind of make sense of suffering. So for Benatar's arguments to work, we have to presuppose that life is valuable. But the conclusion of his arguments is that life ought to cease, which is to say that, actually life is not valuable. Life is not worth starting. Part of the problem with Benatar's arguments, according to Pihlstrom, is that Benatar attempts to adopt a God's eye view on happiness and suffering. So he talks of happiness and suffering, of goodness and badness in the abstract, as though we just kind of aggregate the good states and bad states of a person's life and then weigh them against each other. But these bad experiences might be very meaningful to the person who undergoes those experiences. So Pihlstrom says that Benatar neglects, when considering the good and the bad there may be in a life, the internal experiential perspective of the one who leads that particular life. But of course, it's this very internal experiential perspective that's required in order to make sense of happiness and suffering, of goodness and badness in the first place. Moral commitments can be understood only from within a particular form of life. It doesn't make any sense to sort of look at humanity from this kind of completely detached perspective and then just say, no, like none of these lives are worth living. So Pihlstrom gives a summary of what he calls this kind of transcendental argument against antinatalism. So he says, first, in order to be able to make distinctions between certain experiences of life, or entire lives being good or bad, or beneficial or harmful to the one who lives or to others, we must live a human life. Second, it is possible to live a human life with a capability for normative distinctions like the ones invoked in the first premise, only within a social, cultural form of life in which certain assumptions about valuing the lives of others and oneself are cherished. Therefore, a philosophical argument seeking to establish that there should be no human life at all cannot invoke the kind of conceptual distinctions invoked in the first premise. So that's Pihlstrom's argument. And just a quick advert, I have a Patreon. There are bonus videos available on my Patreon, so you can sign up there and support the channel. I obviously would appreciate that. I also have a PayPal if you just want to throw me some cash. Again, it's very much appreciated. And that's about all there is to say for that little advert. Those are available. Yeah, with that said, let's get back to it. Right. So I think there are several concerns that we might have with with Pihlstrom's argument here. So we'll talk about his specific complaints about antinatalism, and then after that we'll turn to some general problems with the idea of unthinkability. So specifically concerning antinatalism, I mean, with the argument that Pihlstrom gives, I think first of all we can say, well, look, there's a difference between the claim that there should be no human life and the claim that human life should not be valued. I think Benatar pretty clearly values human life in the sense that he takes human beings to be morally considerable. So we can distinguish between a life worth starting versus a life that has moral value. Benatar claims our lives are not worth starting. He doesn't claim that our lives are without moral value, and it seems I don't think those should be conflated. I mean, consider a being that is in constant pain, where the pain really doesn't bring any benefits. Its life is nothing but just extreme suffering. I mean, maybe this is, a being that's been, it's brought into existence with some terrible illness, that, like, I don't know, there's something terribly wrong with, like, its skin is just falling off or something. So it's just basically torture, right? It's just constant torture, and it's going to die. There's not really any hope of saving it or anything like that. Now this being, I think we would say, this is not a life worth living. I mean, that's not a life worth living. That's not a life any of us would choose. And it would be better not to bring such a being into existence. I mean, if you had the option to bring into existence a being whose life is just nothing but extreme suffering, and there's no further benefit, then yeah, it would be a terrible thing to do that. But this being is still of moral value, and indeed, it's precisely because we value sentient beings that we judge it to be a bad thing to bring into existence a sentient being whose life is nothing but extreme suffering. If we just didn't care about sentient beings, we wouldn't be concerned about its suffering, right? So, if I just, so when I look at, when I look at a being that whose life is nothing but extreme suffering, and I feel, sad about that, and I say it would be better if this being had never come into existence, it looks like what's motivating that judgment is partly my concern for that being. Like I am concerned. I'm concerned about it. I'm concerned about its suffering, and that's why I think it's a bad thing that it was brought into existence. If I didn't care about the being, I wouldn't think it was a bad thing that it's here, and that it's suffering. So, so yeah, I think Benatar could reasonably claim that, well, look, I'm what I'm saying, right? What Benatar is saying is, we should cease bringing humans into existence. But what's motivating that is actually a kind of philanthropic concern for the well-being of humans. Like, it's precisely because I care about human beings that I'm saying, this is a net harm. This is something we should be concerned about. This is something we should stop doing. So that's one concern with Pihlstrom's argument here. A second concern. So take the second premise of Pihlstrom's argument. The claim is that the capability for making normative distinctions requires living in a form of life in which certain assumptions about the value of life are cherished. Is this true? Well, I mean, maybe it depends on what exactly those assumptions are. It's worth noting that people have made normative distinctions in cultures with values wildly different from our own. But in any case, even if this premise is true, surely all it shows is that in order to make normative distinctions, I must live in a particular kind of culture. But why do I need to share that culture's values? I mean, provided I live in the relevant culture where those conceptual distinctions are made, then I can invoke those conceptual distinctions. Why do I need to endorse that culture? So by analogy, suppose I were to give an argument for anarcho-primitivism. This is the view that civilization ought to be dismantled and we return to a hunter-gatherer way of life. It may be that a hunter-gatherer culture would just not be able to sustain the sort of conceptual and theoretical work required for anything like modern philosophy. I mean, as far as I know, like, philosophy is something that sort of seems to follow the development of civilization. I'm not sure that you get anything really like modern philosophy in hunter-gatherer cultures. But in any case, let's assume that's true. I mean, it may not be true, but assume that that's true. Assume you don't tend to kind of get this like very sophisticated theoretical conceptual development in hunter-gatherer cultures. So I give a very complex argument for returning to a hunter-gatherer way of life. Now, clearly, the hunter-gatherer themselves could not give the philosophical argument that I give. They couldn't give the argument for preferring hunter-gatherer life over life in civilization. But so what? I'm not a hunter-gatherer. All that's happening here is that I want the world to change into a state such that my argument could no longer be given. But that's not a problem, because if a hunter-gatherer way of life is achieved, then by the lights of my argument for anarcho-primitivism, that very argument would no longer be necessary. And it's the same with the antinatalist. If nobody comes into existence, there will be nobody around to give philosophical arguments. I have an argument for changing the world into a state such that the argument could no longer be made. But that's not a problem, because if humanity goes extinct, then the argument for antinatalism would no longer be necessary. So like, imagine the anarcho-primitivist analogue of Pihlstrom's conclusion, right? A philosophical argument seeking to establish that there should be no civilization cannot invoke the kind of conceptual distinctions that can be made only within civilizations. Well, I mean, that's just absurd, right? I mean, nothing ensures that civilization is, as it were, self-justifying. Nothing ensures that somebody within civilization can't invoke the sorts of conceptual distinctions that can be made only within civilizations when giving a criticism of civilization. And so I would think the same is the case for life, right? So there are a few problems with this example of antinatalism, but I mean, this is obviously only an example, right? Pihlstrom intends this to be an illustration of a general idea of unthinkability. So I think it's maybe worth considering some more general questions about the concept of unthinkability, because even if we dispute Pihlstrom's example of antinatalism, I mean, maybe there are other views that are unthinkable in the relevant sense. So I mean, the first question then is well, are there any, right? Are there any unthinkabilities, any other cases? In particular, are there any uncontroversial cases? So we might start by considering the most outrageous ethical position that you can imagine. For example, it's good to torture children for fun. That's about as obscene and outrageous as an ethical position anybody could ever hold, right? And so we might think, okay, look, nobody would take this seriously, and moreover, nobody ought to take this seriously. There is something repugnant about even assessing the arguments for and against this claim. So this claim should just be ignored. It shouldn't even be argued against. In a sense, we can't argue against it because it's so far outside our ethical framework that there's just not enough common ground from which to initiate any argument. So, to take this seriously, even as a claim with which you disagree, would be to exhibit a kind of callous attitude, or it would be to exhibit some sort of conceptual confusion. Somebody who says it's good to torture children for fun, like it's morally good to torture children for fun. Somebody who says that kind of thing, we would just, we'd just be baffled. It would be baffling, right? So, I mean, maybe this is unthinkable. This is a case of an unthinkability. Now, one worry we might have with using this as an example of an unthinkability is that perhaps the problem is just that we aren't aware of and we can't easily come up with any convincing arguments in favour of it. So, of course, it appears to be off the table come what may, because, we just can't think up any good arguments for it. I mean, maybe we want to say there just are no good arguments for it. There couldn't be any good arguments for it. The question is, how would we react to this if there were seemingly convincing arguments for it? Keep in mind that what's required for an uncontroversial unthinkability is a position which has seemingly good arguments in its favour, but which we refuse to admit because of its moral repugnance. But in the case of something like it's good to torture children for fun, well, this is a position for which there just are no good arguments. Nobody's making good arguments for this kind of claim. Or are they? I mean, there are philosophers who have taken this proposition seriously in some sense. I have a video on the Marquis de Sade. He explicitly promotes brutality, violence, and suffering, and presumably would endorse torturing children for fun, or consider views like moral trivialism, which I discussed in my recent video on moral contradictions. According to moral trivialism, all moral propositions are true, so the proposition it is good to torture children for fun is true. Moral trivialism is endorsed by the Tiantai Buddhists, and they have arguments for their position. I do think it's worth noting, though, that even the arguments given by de Sade and by moral trivialism are arguments for more sort of general conclusions. The conclusion that it's good to impose suffering on others, or the conclusion that all moral propositions are true. In neither case is there an argument specifically for torturing children, in the way that there are arguments for, I don't know, pulling the lever in the trolley case or something. What de Sade and moral trivialism offer us are these more general frameworks that are radically different from our ordinary values. If we proceed from anything like our ordinary values, we're not going to find any reasons in favour of torturing children. So from the ordinary point of view, as it were, there aren't any good arguments in favour of torturing children. So, I suppose the point is just it's going to be hard to find an uncontroversial case of an unthinkability. And maybe there is a deeper issue here. Perhaps there is something problematic about the very idea of unthinkability. Recall that the point of unthinkability is that when a theory is unthinkable, it may be that it is supported by seemingly good arguments, but it's so far outside the values of our form of life that these arguments must be refused. But then if a theory is indeed so far beyond our form of life, how could the arguments in its favour even be seemingly compelling, even be prima facie compelling? So consider this in the case of antinatalism. Pihlstrom grants that for all we know, the arguments in favour of antinatalism are valid and proceed from plausible premises. The antinatalist has not made any logical error or informal fallacy, nor is she appealing to any premise that is obviously false. The issue is that these arguments lead to a position that is just deeply contrary to our form of life. Now, if we grant that Benatar's premises are plausible, how exactly can his arguments lead to a conclusion that's so far removed from our form of life? Like, what is it that makes these premises seemingly compelling? I mean, take the asymmetry argument. Premises like the presence of pain is bad and the presence of pleasure is good, well, they seem like fairly normal features of common sense morality. Somewhat more controversial is a premise like the absence of pain is good even if that good is not enjoyed by anyone. But Benatar appeals to common intuitions in defense of this premise. I mean, it seems to be a good thing, for instance, that there are no famines on Mars, even though the reason why there are no famines on Mars is because there are no living beings on Mars, period. Now, insofar as we find Benatar's arguments seemingly compelling, then, this is going to be because there's something attractive about his premises. But now, if these premises do indeed entail antinatalism, then our common sense moral thinking, the values that underlie our form of life, entail antinatalism. Or at least there's some part of common sense moral thinking, some part of the values that underlie our form of life that can be made to support antinatalism, in which case it's false that antinatalism is totally contrary to our values. So basically, Benatar has given us a set of premises which are entailed by or are in some way supported by our common values. If we grant that Benatar has like good arguments, then it looks like we're going to agree with this. Moreover, these premises entail or in some way support antinatalism. Again, if we grant that Benatar has good arguments, then we should grant this. But in that case, our common values entail or in some way support antinatalism. We have a path from our common values to antinatalism. So antinatalism is not totally contrary to our common values. Now, I framed this in terms of antinatalism, but this is, of course, a general problem, which is going to arise for any position that is claimed to be unthinkable. As long as we have good arguments for the supposedly unthinkable position, then it's really not going. It's not going to be clear. Like, well, given that the argument is like the argument is kind of like a signpost. It's like a path leading us from some common assumptions to this conclusion. And as long as we have that path, as long as the argument is made that path and we're saying, yes, this is a seemingly good argument, then it seems very strange to say, well, the conclusion that it's leading us to is so contrary to our common values that it just has to be refused. Okay, a third issue is there's a worry here about dogmatism, right? The idea of unthinkability is just unreasonably dogmatic. So we are told that a theory is unthinkable when it is contrary to our form of life, but now, why shouldn't forms of life themselves be open to criticism? Interestingly, Pihlstrom notes another two examples of what he considers to be unthinkabilities. So he cites the example of arguing that it's permissible to consume dead bodies and arguing that it's permissible to kill infants, For instance, Peter Singer has argued that it's permissible to kill infants that have severe, incurable disabilities. Now, there are many cultures that have accepted both of these things. I mean, that's one thing to bear in mind, right? There are cultures where it's normal to consume dead bodies, and it's infanticide is normal. So unthinkable does not necessarily mean unthinkable for all of humanity. It may only mean unthinkable for us, given the cultural conventions that happen to prevail here. But if we recognize that there may be other cultures that thrive despite taking seriously or even outright endorsing views that we call unthinkable, we might wonder whether it's really so dangerous to explore these unthinkabilities. And to approach this from a different direction, consider that there are many views unthinkable in other cultures, but which are acceptable in ours. It's easy to imagine a philosopher from 200 years ago arguing it's unthinkable to tolerate homosexuality. It's unthinkable to tolerate interracial relationships. And now the question is, what makes the dismissal of views like antinatalism any more intellectually respectable than what we now recognize as just these forms of just bigotry? Indeed, given the attitudes to homosexuality that prevailed in the relatively recent past, given the way in which society was structured around traditional family units with marriage between one man and one woman, given the thinner line between the public and the private, given the way that sort of property rights were intertwined with the conception of family and marriage and all of this, given all of this, it really seems quite reasonable for somebody back then to say, homosexuality, these homosexual relationships are contrary to our form of life. Just the way that their whole society was structured and the sorts of attitudes that people had back then, it was sort of about holding up the family unit, right? One man, one woman, as this kind of ideal. And so it may have been quite reasonable for them to say, look, this is contrary to our form of life. Now, the right response to this is to change the form of life, right? It's the right response is not to denounce homosexuality, to say, well, no, it's discriminating against homosexual relationships. Like if that's contrary to your form of life, then your form of life sucks, and it should change. So yeah, the appeal to unthinkability is just a kind of disguised dogmatism. Almost any way of life could be maintained like this. For any practice that threatens cultural conventions, I can just dismiss the defense of that practice as unthinkable. And Pihlstrom, really, as far as I can tell, he doesn't really give us any standards by which to distinguish legitimate criticism of a cultural convention from an unthinkability. But if we really have no standards, then it seems like if we start thinking in terms, framing things in terms of unthinkability, then any cultural convention is just going to become unassailable. And notice that one thing this is going to do is lead to a kind of ossification of our own culture. We're no longer going to be able to criticize our own culture, like whatever we happen to be doing. That's just the way it has to be now, because we can't even discuss or think about these alternatives. It's also going to risk a sort of cultural isolation. Cultures with very different ways of life, with practices that we find sufficiently repugnant, are going to just be dismissed rather than engaged with. And of course, it will be reasonable for the members of those cultures to dismiss rather than engage with us. So people living in very homophobic societies today might reasonably say, look, we don't even have to consider toleration of homosexuality. It's not even in the realm of reasonable discussion for us. So we end up with sort of isolated cultures that never engage in self-criticism. Finally, there's a kind of paradox, I think, associated with the notion of unthinkability. So when we claim for any position X that X is unthinkable, so that X is off the table of reasonable discussion and that it ought to be ignored rather than argued against, this will be controversial. There will be people who argue in favour of taking X seriously. This might include people who favour the general idea of unthinkability. So even if I think that some positions are unthinkable, I might dispute the claim that X specifically is unthinkable. And of course, there are going to be, some people who just reject unthinkability in general, right? But The point is, if we claim that X is unthinkable, we're going to need to give an argument in support of this. And this argument is going to need to consider specific features of X. But then we're discussing X. So it looks like, in practice, we're not treating X as unthinkable. I mean, we saw this play out in the case of antinatalism. Pihlstrom has to get into the nitty-gritty details of Benatar's arguments. He has to point to the problem of economic metaphors, of, Benatar's supposed attempts to adopt a God's eye view of the problem of self-defeat. I mean, these objections involve examining the features of antinatalism, and all of the claims that Pihlstrom is making here are going to be controversial. Pihlstrom is arguably mistaken about what antinatalism actually involves, and Pihlstrom faces a self-defeat. So Pihlstrom faces a kind of self-defeat problem of his own. I mean, in his very attempt to argue that antinatalism is off the table of discussion, he has to place it on the table and discuss it. So in general, any argument that X is unthinkable will be an argument against X. Certain features of X are bad, dangerous, contrary to our values, and so on. But if we're giving that argument, we're arguing about X. We're not treating X as unthinkable. Moreover, I think there is a question about how we should respond to unthinkabilities. Should we encourage exploration of unthinkabilities in some restricted contexts? Maybe we're inclined to think that philosophy serves an important function of resisting dogmatism, so we think that fundamental assumptions should be brought into question. Should we refuse to discuss unthinkabilities in any context? Should we tolerate exploration of them in other domains, like in fictions? So maybe philosophers ought not to take antinatalism seriously, but it's acceptable to write fictional characters who argue for it. Should we outlaw discussion of it entirely? Again, any claim we make here is going to be controversial. And in defending this claim, we're going to need to examine the features of X, right? Whether we say, look, we can discuss X within fictions, or we just refuse to discuss it entirely, or we outlaw it. Whatever we say, that's going to be controversial, and in defending what we say, we're going to need to examine the features of X. So again, we're going to be discussing X. So any case that's made for unthinkability, any way that we respond to the supposed unthinkability, is going to be kind of paradoxical, because we will have to talk about the thing that's supposed to be, according to our own argument, off the table of reasonable discussion. Well, that's all for now, so thanks for watching. I will see you in the next video. Goodbye.